So I'm a pretty slow reader, and one of the reasons for that is that when I read things that interest me, I I have thoughts about that. And it helps me to record the thoughts, publish them, so then that's off my mind. All right, so, no, actually I'm almost done, so I'm not going to record this on the toilet. So that would be what is called the Zeigarnik effect. Because I was fully about to start recording about the censor myth, and then I was like, no, I don't want to do it right now. But that was enough for me to feel like the task was kind of started or sort of taken care of in a sense, and I was able to continue reading. So watch the video on the Zeigarnik effect. Basically, you have something that you want to do, it's eating away at you, and then one way to make it stop eating away at you is to do the task, obviously, and then the brain kind of just can delete it. Or is to come up with a plan for how you're going to tackle the thing. But anyway, watch that video. It's in the Voices chapters. Okay, so there you go. That's a little bonus, the Zeigarnik effect. Number two thing that I want to talk about, the main thing, is what I call the censor myth. I'm just started calling it that, so I don't know whether that's what I'm going to call it, or maybe I'll just adopt whatever name is already in circulation for it when I come across that, or you can tell me. And then there's the third thing, is because I actually only made it about 3 lines. So I read about a total of a paragraph, and no, 2 paragraphs. And in the second paragraph, there's this thing called a frame contest. So I'm going to tell you about that first. So I'm reading from How Minds Change, still from the chapter Socks and Crocs. Psychologists call this a frame contest when the facts are agreed upon. For instance, mass shootings are a problem, but the interpretation of those facts is not. For instance, it's because of X versus no, it's because of Y. So that's a cool term, a frame contest. When the facts are agreed upon, and I think it's almost always the case. I'm really interested in learning more about this frame contest, because we basically have the same morality, all humans, unless, you've added some rules like from a religious text. But at the end of the day, we want people to be happy, and we have certain values of fairness and justice and all that stuff. The justice ones that we have in common are unfortunate, but we have a kind of cool fairness thing and so on. So if ultimately, you could say that, couldn't you say that everything is a frame contest? So I'm really excited about reading about that. Okay, so a frame contest is when the facts are agreed upon. So, for instance, if you're talking about, I don't know, abortion or something, you want people to be healthy, and you want, good families, let's say. I guess there are some fundamental facts in that question that aren't really agreed upon. But, anyway, okay, so that was a little bonus. All right, now I want you to hear what I have to say about the censor myth. One of the brain has lots of illusions, lots of overconfidence. It has the illusion of attention, illusion of understanding. It thinks that because we don't notice gaps in our reality, we think that they're filled in. Because we think that we pay attention to, what, in this video I'm going to try to finish my sentences. Okay, we think that we pay attention to all of the different things around us. That's the illusion of attention, because we don't notice the things that we didn't pay attention to. The illusion of understanding is that we feel familiar with a thing, so we think we understand it, but then actually there's a whole bunch of gaps in our understanding. And that's demonstrated when we have to then demonstrate that understanding, and we go, oh, we can't even answer questions that would demonstrate that understanding. All right, on page 82 of How Minds Change, there's the following line. When faced with uncertainty, we often don't notice we are uncertain. So I just read that today. I had previously read um, to myself, and I think I read to you as well in the previous HMC video. So page 80, it says, so this is a quote from Pascal: "There are more than 30 steps in visual processing before an image reaches consciousness." Okay, and then the author continues, "You are only aware of the result, not the processes. At no point in processing the image of the dress," and of course you guys remember the dress from life, "did anyone feel the uncertainty that led to their disambiguation." Okay, because basically the previous pages had been talking about how we make these decisions when there's ambiguity. We sort of decide certain interpretations, but the thing is, we don't feel the uncertainty that was happening when we had to make those decisions. So when we were faced with that ambiguity, we didn't feel uncertainty. And so then we're seeing the dress and we're like, oh, it's black and blue. Oh, it's white and gold. Without having ever experienced that it wasn't actually so obvious at certain points in our mental interpreting of it. Okay. And when I had read that, I thought, but there's an unfair assumption in this. When the brain was faced with ambiguity and had to disambiguate, there might not have been any uncertainty felt even by those mechanisms. The feeling of uncertainty requires an uncertainty sensor in the mind, a mechanism that goes, hey, I think we're uncertain. And that mechanism isn't always running. Of course not. I don't need to have a mechanism going, hey, we're not actually sure. Let's see, which of those, I'm looking at two fences, which of those fences is in the foreground and which one is in the background? Because, well, they're just like, this far apart from each other. And for a second, because of the different colors and stuff, no, I'm not. All right. You see there's a silver fence. For you, it's obvious. And then there's like a brown fence. You see that brown post. You can't even actually see the brown gridiron, the brown. Okay, but whatever. So I don't need an alarm going off. I don't need any mechanism evaluating how ambiguous that image in my periphery is. It is ambiguous. And when I look at it, my brain is making certain decisions about how to disambiguate that. And it's deciding, okay, that is behind. Then I look at it more carefully, and that's why it feels confusing, because it keeps kind of switching. It's only now when I'm looking at it more clearly and I've made it my objective to understand which fence is first, that the mechanism of ambiguity is sort of running and going, yeah, all right, it's ambiguous. Because now I am feeling the uncertainty. But before I started looking at it, when I was just trying to give this example, there's no evolutionary advantage for that ambiguity to be felt. Okay? All right. So, my point is that lots of times there is ambiguity without a feeling of ambiguity. But often people assume that if there's ambiguity, then the brain felt ambiguity. And that's the sensor myth. And so I had only read that thing on page 80. At no point in processing the image of the dress did anyone feel the uncertainty that led to this disambiguation. The uncertainty. So the objective, let's rephrase it as the objective uncertainty. So in that one couldn't be certain. So that lack of adequate information is what led to the disambiguation. But why would we feel that? So that shouldn't be surprising. when I'm nervous, I feel like I'm getting a few followers. People are watching these people I don't know, and that's not actually what's actually supposed to be happening, because this is how I work. I just accept that. Okay. But then, and I thought, all right, you know what? Never mind, because that sentence wasn't the censor myth as much as maybe I thought. But then I got to this sentence today. So I'm on the toilet and I read this. When faced with uncertainty, we often don't notice we are uncertain. I don't know whether actually this is the censor myth. When faced with uncertainty, we often don't notice we are uncertain. But we're not uncertain, though. That's why I'm saying it's the censor myth, because we are not uncertain. Just because there is objective uncertainty that one should be uncertain doesn't mean that the brain actually is uncertain, in the sense that, well, any of that sense is running. A more accurate way to phrase this, I think, would be when faced with uncertainty. So when faced with objective uncertainty, there's inadequate information. We often don't notice there is inadequate information. We often don't notice the uncertainty. But then when you start to use it as an adjective, we often don't notice we are uncertain. We are not. I don't think in any meaningful way, even the disambiguating systems were uncertain. There was never that aspect to it. Now, maybe you want to define uncertain as an adjective as being having to cope with inadequate information. So we often don't notice that we are having to deal or having to cope or adjust with it for inadequate information. And yes, that sentence is true. Let me give you some other examples of the censor myth. It happens often when we talk about certain gosh, I don't even know whether I'm publishing this. When we talk about certain abilities that we have, we trust our brain's censor of those things. So, for instance, my dad recently said to me that he has a very good sense of time, a very good time mechanism. And he would tell me about these instances where he would have to deliver a package for a job that he was working, and he had to estimate when he would arrive at the delivery spot. And he would always get it like perfectly right. I don't know whether this is the censor myth. So this is kind of a work together. Oh, that's what we should have just called this. This is a work together, because we're coming up with this together. All right. Tell me whether you think that the different things I'm describing have something in common, and whether that thing they have in common could be just called the censor myth. So first of all, whether there's one label for these different instances I'm talking about, and then two, well, first just that question, and then two would be like, what's a clever name for it? All right, so I don't. Sorry, I had another example, and I'm trying to remember how that one happened. All right, fuck this video. Okay, all right, that's okay. All right, so the censor myth. No, I don't trust my dad's evaluation of his sense of time. I also think that I have an exceptional sense of time because of lots of instances where, um, I set a timer for something and then I go to pick up the timer and there's 1 second left. Um, when I'm cooking or something. That feels like that happens really often. Does that mean that I have a good sense of time? I don't know. Maybe it just means that I have a good sense of 5 minutes, and maybe that's often the time that I'm running. Or maybe I have a good sense of 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and 7 minutes. And so maybe I'd be going too far to say that I have a good sense of time in general. Same thing with my dad, maybe. Maybe he had a good sense of how long it takes to drive X number of miles in X conditions. And because he always had the same shift, he's always working the same times. Um, so maybe, yeah, he had a good sense of time for that, but that doesn't mean he generally necessarily has a good sense of time. Where if I say, okay, I'm going to start a timer for blank, and no matter what he's doing, and then he'll be able to tell me, maybe we can't go that far. And we do know that the self-serving bias exists. My dad doesn't know, but if you're watching this channel, hopefully you've read The Art of Thinking Clearly, or you've glanced at it, or you've bought it, you've started it. Maybe you are not so smart. Maybe you are now less dumb. Maybe you just read online lists of cognitive biases. And so we know that we have this self-serving bias. And so we just have to be careful when we talk about some capacity, some ability that we have. But is this more of like an over-reliance on our memory, on our statistical sort of evaluations? Maybe this isn't the sense myth at all, the sensor myth at all. All right, let me try to give you another example. So when my dad and I were talking about time, my dad was saying that in an emergency, I got to review the audio of this conversation, but the way that I am thinking about it now is that he said in an emergency, the brain slows down time to give itself more time to process things, which doesn't make sense to me. There is an assumption there that in an emergency situation, the time sensor, that mechanism, the time mechanism, is running, and it is... I got to review that conversation. Here's what I suggest as an alternative. What if, in an emergency situation, just like how digestion is put on pause in an emergency situation, when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, your stuff that you were doing that was running in the background that can wait gets put on pause so that you're ready. Your energy is allocated to one of the 4 F's. Oh, and if English isn't your first language, that's fighting, fleeing, whatever the acronym is in for you guys. No. Sorry, it's just those 2 F's. I was confusing with the functions of the hypothalamus, which are the 4 F's. Okay. So an emergency response, fight, flee, or I guess, well, no, not fright, but fight or flee. I guess, yes, fright, because that's why you shit your pants, because the muscles contracting in the anus, energy stops getting sent there, so that you can focus on, so that the energy is focused on the situation, and then you end up releasing and shitting yourself. So, yeah, in fight, flight, or fright. Okay, well, just like how that happens, what if we don't really need to keep track of time? It would be advantageous to know, okay, and then half a second later that happened, blah, blah. But we know from memories of emergency situations that people do not have a good sense of time in those situations. So why don't we then take from that, okay, so the time sensor isn't really running during emergency situations, which is why, A, it can be described as happening in slow motion, even though time didn't obviously slow down. And so, but you're re-estimating the time now as you think about it based on the details that you have. And you may have a lot of details because it was an emergency situation. So your brain was paying attention to some things, to more than maybe it usually does, or to different things. And so it's a richer moment. And then now that the time mechanism is back online, it goes, oh, well, with that much richness, all right, that took this long, and then we have this sense that it took a different amount of time than it did. But then it depends on how we're recollecting it, because I think was making a list of two, because other times, because also sometimes when we're thinking about it, we describe it as having taken a long time, but also having happened like that. Um, so I think that just it's the obvious sort of thing to then assume there is that the time mechanism just isn't running. And why would it be running? So, um, but the assumption that the time mechanism is always running, the assumption that the uncertainty mechanism is always running, that's sort of what I'm trying to describe as the sensor myth. But maybe also what I'm trying to describe as the sensor myth is the reliance on the uncertainty mechanism, on the time mechanism, is giving us true senses. Um, yeah, another example of this is for flashbulb memories, which are, in these emergency situations or when there's some major news, such as an assassination or, some kind of criminal proceeding that everybody wants to know what happened, and the verdict comes out, and then we know where we were at that time and stuff, and we have these very vivid details of when we learned about this thing happening. Right? So it's a couple years later. Oh yeah, I was sitting here, turned on the TV, saw it there. I was with this person. We had just been talking about this, and then later, blah, blah. Okay. We trust that vividness. We use that vividness, that sense of vividness, as an indication of the veracity. And experiments in a flashbulb memories have shown that that isn't a reliable indication of veracity, how vivid the details are. So despite their being vivid, they are not reliable. All right, so then here is a thing that has stuck with me, but I've forgotten the details of it, or the details that I have now aren't matching what the other feelings I had about this story. I'm at a restaurant in Paris. This is about 7 years ago, I think. I'm with my dad, my mom, my sister, and her friend, a young French woman. So we're all having lunch. The server comes. Fuck. The server comes, takes our order. Yes, that's what it was. Yes. Okay. All right. So now, okay. I mean, I think that this is it, but it definitely lines up with how I remember judging the situation. But hey, don't trust me. we don't have anything else to work on though. So try to trust me. And this is I'm gonna say this is something I think back to often. But I think back to it often because of these details. So it's not like I think back to it often because of some other details, in which case we shouldn't. I may be reconstructing the details I'm about to talk about. But no, I think back to it because of these details. So maybe you can trust me. I don't know. Okay. All right. So here's what happens. Server comes out, takes our order. Server goes back inside. A woman who may or may not be the server comes out. I add something to my order. She looks at me a little bit funny. I go, "Weren't you the server that we just had?" She says that she isn't, that was her twin sister, but that she'll tell her. She goes back inside. We laugh about it at the table, and Louise, my sister's friend, she's about 17 or something, she she says, "Oh yeah, I knew it wasn't the same person. I'm really really good with faces, and sometimes I'll be like walking down the street and I will see someone and maybe I don't know their name or where I met them, but like I'll know like, oh, I've met that person before. It's like once I see a face, I don't forget it." And my dad's eating this up. I'm skeptical. I do not believe that she has this face ability that she thinks she has. Um, but I can't really say anything because these two sisters who look like the exact same person to me, when she saw the second one, didn't feel familiar. And since she has this perfect face sense, well, that's been demonstrated here, I guess. I mean, here's another instance where you nailed it. Because these two sisters, maybe even twins, I think the server had said, um, are so good with faces that you knew that this was a new twin. So anyway, so she's pretty proud of herself for that. Not that a bad thing. It's just we have an overconfidence in our abilities. Um, I'm thinking, I don't believe it. I don't believe you're as good as you think you are at it, because that just sounds like a thing a brain would say without it being true. Brains say stuff like that. Brains believe stuff like that. And also, have you tested it? Have you tested it? Have you like these people that you mentioned, like seeing in the road, and so you had the sense of familiarity, and you're trusting the sense of familiarity. Have you tested the sense of familiarity? Because you said you often don't know where you know them from or what their name is, but are you testing it? Are you saying, hey, you and I need to sit down and we need to go through our life paths and see where we intersected, and then if we find that we went to the same school, we have to actually make sure that we intersected at that school. Are you doing that? Or is it often just a sense of familiarity? You just assume that it's true, and then maybe one time in your life you were like, "Oh, bro, I know you," and then you guys figured it out, and then that for you proved all the other instances where you felt like something was familiar. Or I mean, where you know what I mean. All right, well, here's what happens next in the story. Um, long story short, we find out that this server, this cutie pie, was just like sort of messing with people, and I fell in love with her when I learned that this was not real, that there was no twin sister, um, because she sold it. I absolutely believed it. Um, I was still skeptical of Louise's confidence in her ability to distinguish and remember faces, but I wasn't questioning whether or not, in this instance, by coincidence, she happened to have not recognized blah blah. Turns out it was the same person. It turns out she had just gone and put a scarf on or something. That's probably why Louise didn't recognize her. And I think that's like what she had explained to her. She said, when you guys like didn't recognize me or something, I just went with it and came up with this twin thing. Or maybe that's something she does often. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, um, another one is, thinking that you have a good sense of people's vibes. When I meet people, like I know whether it's someone I'm going to get along with or not. You're not testing that. And also bullshit because I know that you have really clicked with certain people and those relationships did not work out. I know that you're the type of person who's probably been terribly betrayed by someone, and you're like, oh my gosh, and they were so manipulative, blah 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 blah, and yet you had gotten a good feeling at first, And I know you're probably like, now you're probably like, yeah, but also my intuition was telling me, but I didn't listen to it. Stop lying. You follow your intuition. Stop lying. Of course, the brain is lots of different things. So there's not a single sort of intuitive instinct. There is one going, trust this person, another going, don't trust this person. And when it turns out that you can trust this person, you go, ah, shit, I should have listened to my intuition. But stop it. You weren't like, your intuition wasn't screaming, don't trust the person. You were like, oh, but there are no facts not to. And I'm a factual person. So I'm going to continue to spend time and enjoy this person, even though my whole body's screaming, don't do it. And if you're going to describe to me, oh, yeah, no. But if you're thinking about somebody right now for whom your body was screaming to get away, okay, sometimes in certain interactions, your body may have been screaming. In other interactions, it was going, no, blah blah blah. Or maybe you were still just, you weren't, your body was never screaming to stay with the person, but you were remembering back when your body was screaming with this person and all the great moments that you had, and that's why you stay with it, even though now your body's saying get out. But also, no, your body is also saying stay in. There are different parts of your, there are different conflicting mechanisms running. I know we all have one. I have one. I think that I have a great sensor for for maybe which country someone is from, and then for whether someone is a tourist or not. I have not tested this. There are obviously self-confirming things. Like I see someone with a backpack, kind of looking around, and I go, "That's obviously a tourist." Okay, that is obviously a tourist. And then, and then I'm going to go, look, yeah, it proves it because they're looking around and they have a backpack. No, that was the original reason that you said that. So that's one of those like self-confirming ones. Have you tested it? I remember I was hanging out with a woman one time, and we're not going to call it a date. We were in a cemetery, and I was like, let's test it because we both have this impression that we're good at it. I'm skeptical about our actual ability to do that. So I was like, let's test it. Where are they from? First of all, are they tourists? And then where are they from? Then we ended up talking to the couple, and they were tourists, and we both thought that they were tourists, and then we ended up talking to them, and so we didn't end up testing it any more than that. Anywho, that's a sensor myth. And so the way I'm defining it now in this video, and this is something that it's been bothering me for years, this reliance that we have. Like we just go with it. And I remember I was trying to talk to my dad about a sense of time in the delivery. I was like, yeah, but you might not actually have. Yes, I do. And then he would give me anecdotal evidence. He would tell me about an instance. My boss would say, hey, what time will you be dropping this off? And I would give it to him. And then when I arrived, I look at the clock, and that's exactly the time. I believe you have that memory, and I believe you have that sense of your sense. But I just think that, all right, so it's two parts. One, we assume that the senses are always running. So whether that be the sense of time, whether that be the sense of whatever, sense of time, sense of, I don't remember what other examples we've used. Oh, sense of uncertainty. We assume that they are mechanisms that are always running. Number two, their outputs we assume are true. That's going to be important. So we've got the ego myth, which is the idea that the myth that there's this central figure, the ego, and then there's like the id and the superego or whatever, or there's the ego, and then you've got your conscience, the angels, or whatever. But anyway, that there's this one self thing, that ego, that's a myth. Number two, we've got the judge myth, which is, or maybe the ego myth is part of that, but the judge myth, that there is this figure in the brain that is listening to all the other activity in the brain. All of it's being passed through, and this judge, this central figure, is then deliberating on all this information and values and biases and so on, and then making some informed decision. So that includes sort of the ego myth, the myth of rationality, and the myth of integration. The myth of integration being that everything known in the brain is known everywhere in the brain. Everything that exists in the brain exists everywhere in the brain or influences appropriately everywhere in the brain. That's not true. Um, and so then now we have the sense myth. I don't know exactly how to organize, classify ego myth, judge myth, and the integration myth. I don't know if there should be some hierarchy there. And then the sense myth is, yeah. I think maybe all these could fit into the judge myth, and then you could include the sense myth as the judge doesn't even exist, but um, there's this assumption that every member of the courtroom is always doing their job, is always thinking about their aspect of the case, is always saying their thing, noticing their thing, and then also the notes that they're keeping as they're doing their thing are reliable. So yeah, we could say it's all the judge myth. We have this, we imagine the mind as being um, even when we accept all the different other pieces of the mind, we still think of there's this central judge who is reasonable, able to deliberate with all of this activity, and according to all of this activity, and is hearing all of this activity, all information, all documents, all evidence gets passed through this judge, and the judge hears all the testimony and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So let's say that the big human problem is the judge myth. Piece one, the ego myth, that there is the perspective that you have is the same as the decision maker and all this, it's essential thing. Two, the reason myth, that there's this well-informed, deliberating central figure, or that the central figure, the ego, is deliberating and well-informed and reasonable. Three, that this central figure has control over the other mechanisms. Which is not one of the myths that we've mentioned. Four, that the central figure receives all of the information, testimony, whatever, from the other figures, from the other occupants of the courtroom, the denizens of the mind. Which is our integration myth. So we've done the ego myth, we've done the integration myth. This is all part of the judge myth. We added in the whatever we're gonna call that, or we add the reason myth. And then what was the thing that I have never really mentioned? Oh, the control myth, the internal control myth, which is kind of the free will myth. And then finally, we have this reliance that this isn't actually like a courtroom, but imagine that the members of the courtroom, they have different jobs to do of things they have to pay attention to, maybe outside of the courtroom or inside, whatever. So there's one person who has to keep time, for instance, of the proceedings. There's another person there's the stenographer who has to keep notes. There's someone who's just always checking the weather outside. There's someone who's always making sure that evidence doesn't conflict, whatever. So anyway, there's this myth, this assumption that all of those guys are constantly diligently working and keeping notes that we can then see and rely on. So the censor myth. So there we go. That's how we'll do it. So the judge myth is composed of the Warsaw illusions plus the censor thing plus the control. So the judge myth is control. The occupants of the courtroom are constantly doing their jobs and we can rely on them. Integration, the ego myth, that there even be a central figure. The reason myth, that the judge be equipped to do this. All right, very good. So we're fleshing out the judge myth. We will publish this because we're fleshing out ways to conceptualize the way we misrepresent ourselves, the way we see ourselves that's wrong. By the way, so instead, imagine there is no judge. I mean, it's called the judge myth. So imagine there is no judge. So take out the ego. So there's not one central thing. Take that out. Then we don't have to even worry about trying to remember that the judge isn't reasonable in deliberating and all that, because there is actually no judge. So first of all, just zap that dude out. Second of all, understand that the diligent workers in the courtroom aren't so diligent. And third of all, understand that the members of the courtroom aren't all communicating with each other. Certainly not through some central judge. That person's gone. So just imagine a bunch of people yelling at each other, and then just the loudest one who can pass their message on. That's the message that gets announced from the courtroom. That becomes the verdict in that case. So imagine that our cases being resolved, just a bunch of townspeople yelling at each other until a verdict pops out. There you go. Okay, good.